Really what I want to talk to you today about is the challenges and opportunities that technology presents for us in the urbanisation or the cycle of urban development. And I guess it's particularly relevant from a global trend, where we all know that there's a general trend towards people living in large cities, but we see it on our doorstep here in Auckland too, with whether it's housing challenges, looking at light rail to airports. You've all seen in the media in the last couple of days the ideas of stadiums. There's no shortage of things to address in the city that are exciting, but also present challenges. Excuse me. In looking at that whole area, I thought it'd be useful just to look at the context of what we're dealing with in terms of the drivers for change. And the theme today, I guess, is technology, and we know, I think, that there's rapid change in technology coming. I think you'll hear more from Cheryl about the disruptive forces there. And in fact, the challenge of city leaders having to deal with changes in technology isn't a new thing. In fact, over 100 years ago, people are having to deal with the fact that steam trains were coming and would have to somehow be integrated into cities. And I remember I lived in Cambridge for a number of years, and the train station was annoying because it was a mile out of the centre of town, and that was because the leaders of the city at the time were not very keen on the whole idea of trains, and so they put it as far away from the centre of the city as possible. I guess what's different today really is just the rate of change. How much technology is changing. There are a lot of technologies that have been around for a long time, but just the ongoing exponential I guess drop in cost of computing just means that these technologies become that much more accessible, and we're seeing convergence of so many of them, whether it's processing power, memory, and those sorts of things. And what that's driving is changes in behaviour. So the days where city leaders and shapers could decide where I go to shop, how I get from A to B, where the precincts are going to be where I work, those things are changing because I, as an individual or as a consumer, can actually make different choices. If I decide not to go to the mall but actually go online to do my shopping, that has an impact. That has an impact on capacity for people who are supplying stuff. And it also means changes in dynamics. So, for example, that could drive a lot of smaller commercial vehicle traffic, doing lots of point-to-point distribution. And so does that increase congestion? Does it change it? If those vehicles become more autonomous and actually there's a lot more optimization of sharing those vehicles, does that improve it? There's all of these different things going on. If I decide to put lots of solar power into my home and lots of battery storage, what does that do for the people who have to solve the problems of power distribution and generation and the whole market around how that gets funded and paid for dramatically changes. We see things like the impact of social media, where the community can be much more actively engaged in lobbying and driving opinion, and lobbyists and other parties can actually drive agendas that have an implication. So we're seeing a shift from our ability, as much as we might want to centrally control and architect things, into a situation where more and more things are outside our control. And so what does that mean in terms of how we design cities for the future? There are other things there, like we're seeing, if I decide that I'm going to have my pizza delivered to me by drones, for example, are we going to see lots and lots of drones buzzing around cities and creating noise? Is that something we want? Do we have to deal with mundane issues like if those drones fall onto the road, whose problem is that to solve and clean up? And are we going to end up with little lines in our rates bill for drone mopping up fees and those sorts of challenges? Who knows? But I guess the point is there's lots of things happening quite rapidly. And in cities, we don't tend to do things quickly. Some of the most fundamental infrastructure things we've done, so think something like the Waterview Tunnel, great outcome for the city. I know someone in Beca who started working on that 17 years ago in some of the early stages of it. So how we address the speed of change with those kinds of processes is really interesting. If we just reflect back on exponential change in technology, a proxy I use for that to see just how rapidly are things moving is I look at scary robot videos, because they're quite a good measure of just how quickly things are changing. I've got one here from Boston Dynamics. People have probably heard of them. They got a bit of press in the Herald over the last week with their latest one. This is about 6 months old. Boston Dynamics were owned by Google about 3 years ago. They looked at their motto of "Don't be evil" and decided to sell it. But it's quite interesting. So probably 18 months ago, this thing would have had to have been tethered to a cable because it wouldn't have been able to get enough power. Now with battery technology, it can power itself. It's using smart materials. It's got a hell of a lot of onboard processing. It's sensing its environment. And also obviously got some pretty clever technology on board in terms of gyros and those sorts of things. This is actually, again, you can see here they've actually had to tether it because this is using more brain power than it's got on board, but that's some pretty clever stuff that's going on there. I guess my intent of showing this is not to suggest that we're going to have lots of these running around on the streets, but as just a reminder of just with the level of technology we have available right now, this is what's possible. And in terms of computing power, we know that actually we're going to have more and more available to us. Even I think it's off to the local schoolyard to terrorise the children. But you start to think about, I can envisage a near future where we will have lots of robots running around doing maintenance. We'll be changing how we do construction. And so how do you deal with that from a regulatory point of view? So you think about the city environment, multimodal transport. We struggle to keep pedestrians and cyclists and cars separated, let alone what happens if you've got these things running around the place. So obviously we've got all those changes to deal with, and so you've got this rapid change. We've got consumers getting more involved, less ability to centralise the governance of these things. So therefore, the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how do we position ourselves to frame up cities for the future that actually create a really good human experience and future-proof for these kinds of things so we can really leverage them. And the science fiction writers will say, well, it's all too hard to manage and we end up with a really dystopian future and it's all going to be Blade Runner and cyborgs running around trying to kill everybody. There's the others who say, well, technology is fantastic, it's going to solve all our problems. This might not be your vision of utopia, but it'll all be wonderful. We won't have to work. Machines will be doing everything for us. And what's interesting for me at the moment is to observe that actually in a lot of urban environments, we go to a great deal of trouble to preserve the past. And I think part of that is because in some respects we don't trust ourselves to create a new legacy that has the same kind of human experience for us that this does. So how do we address that? So what I've got here is just a bit of I guess a cycle of urban development. So understanding what's going on around our complicated city environment, how we leverage that to make decisions about what we're going to do. And that leads to some kind of transformation. We're changing the fabric of the city and the community. And then how do we operate that for best effect? So I thought what I'd do is just go through each of those areas, talk about what the potential technology can provide us in those sorts of things, and then look at actually what are we really facing as a fundamental challenge at the end of all of this that as a group of people interested in these areas we can do something about. So I think this is a really rapidly changing area in where technology is really helping us start to understand what's going on. If you think about up until recently, a lot of the information about a city is pretty tightly held. It's been kept by public agencies and for good reasons, not being distributed too much. And we're in a situation now where actually there's a lot of that public information being made more widely available. There's lots of information about assets and geography and services about cities that are now available on the internet. There are such scenarios, and it's happening in New Zealand where, and Martin might talk about this, where we're actually starting to experiment about, well, if we make some of that information available, if we start to blend it with information that service providers like transport companies and so on have, maybe we can start helping people make more informed decisions about how they navigate cities, about where they spend their money, those sorts of things. And then, of course, we've got the information that I'm deciding to share, and I might be making a deliberate decision, or I'm doing it anyway, with the social information that's available about me. So, which is quite useful information when we think about consumerisation and so on. And so with the advent of big data and the analytics and machine learning that can sit over the top of that to make use of it, we start to be able to see some pretty interesting things we can look at across silos in a city environment. And that's helping us also visualise what's going on, whether it's with modelling and other techniques. I think that it brings with it lots of opportunity. It creates the opportunity for the public and other parties to innovate using that. And it brings some challenges with it. And I think I'll just put that diagram on the right-hand side there, just to sort of illustrate the journey that we've been on quite recently with how we as individuals access information. So not that long ago, if you had a question to answer, you would go to a website, you'd go to Google, you'd type in a question and you get an answer. We've pretty quickly gone to a situation where actually we're much more app-driven. I've got lots of apps on this phone that are answering specific things for me. They're bringing me the insight that I want to know about what's happening with the swell map tomorrow, can I take my boat out? Those sorts of things are being tailored to me. We're rapidly moving to a scenario where actually the computing environment around me knows actually where I am, what I'm trying to do, and it's making stuff happen without me necessarily having to engage that directly. So there's some really interesting things in there. So if that's the future we want, we're actually being quite dependent on, well, whose data is fueling that, and actually whose artificial intelligence is owning and governing that. And come back to, if you're trying to run a city-state or a city, who's really in control? So, if it's Google Maps that are telling people how best to get around your city, and it's TripAdvisor that's telling them where to stay and which restaurants to go to, is that a good thing? Is it a negative thing? To what extent do we need to be able to influence that? Because we're not dealing necessarily with altruistic organisations. It was not that long ago that Google got a bit of a slap across the wrist in Europe for some of its potentially anti-competitive behaviour around retail and so on. There's a big question in there around security. There was a reason that people hold information quite tightly about national infrastructure, because it's a potential threat to national security if people that you don't want to have that information about how to target your infrastructure and critical infrastructure. Organised crime, if the more information that's available about where the good thing is to go and steal, that's a factor. So lots of opportunity and some issues for us to potentially think about as we manage that. But there's no doubt that we've got more and more information available to us, and the ability to bridge across silos. We're very good as humans to take a city and break it into lots of little buckets. This is creating the opportunity to look across the whole human experience in a city and think about what does that look like. So I think the opportunity for community engagement and getting the community involved in the problem solving. Often local people understand the issues in their neighbourhood the best and what the solutions might be for that. And having that collaborative decision making. We're seeing more and more human-centred design, and I think Cheryl might talk about this, but how do we put people in the middle of understanding what the right sort of outcome is, and more looking at sort of social benefits accounting. So this idea that it's not just about a financial return making a change to one bit of the fabric of the city, but thinking about actually what are all the benefits when we think about, is it going to improve homelessness? Is it going to improve other factors of quality of living, as well as actually having a commercial return? And we're seeing that more and more, but I think the ability to have more fact-based decision making around decisions that you make, which are generally quite complex when we're changing one part of the urban environment. I think a good example of this for me is, how do you bring lots of different stakeholder groups together and make really good decisions for an outcome? This is, we did some work out at Auckland Airport for about 3 years a while ago to really optimise the whole operation of the airport. And it was getting everyone, it's like a mini city in its own right. So you have government agencies, you've got service providers in the form of airlines, and about 9 million citizens going through that area, and everyone with different agendas and drivers and objectives. But what we found is if you get everyone motivated around actually it's in all of our interest to get people through that airport as quickly as possible, for various reasons. It might be so I can divert my frontline resources somewhere else, those sorts of things. It's immensely powerful. Your alternatives are you either build more airport or you make it work better. And over that 3-year period, we got that airport running about 60% more efficiently, without really having to change resourcing. It was all about having really good stakeholder decision-making groups that could span the whole airport and people empowered to make decisions. And using technology so we could actually measure what was happening in terms of every decision, every change that was made, we could measure did it have a positive or negative impact on that human experience through the airport. We provided analytics to people in frontline positions to show how many passports of what type were coming through the air towards the airport, because you normally have at least 3 hours warning, so you could actually make better decisions across the whole airport. And it was a real illustration to me to think about what if you applied that same thinking to something like Auckland City, across all of the entities and so on, around how we make best decisions. Let's talk about transformation now, and certainly in the world of designing things and building things, there has been a lot of rapid change in terms of how we use technology. It's bringing new ways of making things. People will be familiar with 3D printing and so on. That's scaling up into lots of different areas, and actually driving a lot of smart materials development, which was probably quite hadn't really developed much for a long time. We're seeing, I think, particularly if you think about the building of buildings and roads and infrastructure, it's a construction sector that actually hasn't probably changed from a productivity point of view much in the last 20 years or so. And so we're starting to see some translation from things like industrial manufacturing, production line type thinking into that kind of environment. So you start to have more factory-based building construction of things. And also, if we think about the ability to use technology to really understand more about what's going on in an environment by putting more sensors and other things in place, actually designing for that from the outset so we can actually build that stuff in is becoming more and more feasible. So we'll just go through some examples. In terms of making things, as I mentioned, 3D printing for prototyping. You've probably seen videos of apartment buildings being concrete printed in China, for example. The idea of borrowing from nature for new forms, where you tell the artificial intelligence, here's the kind of outcome I want, you work out what might be the best way of doing it, is starting to create the opportunity for quite new and different and elegant forms and structures, which we're starting to see translate into new forms of architecture. And the opportunity to engage with that design in new and different ways, so that instead of looking at a two-dimensional drawing, you're actually fully engaging with a virtual representation of this thing that we're looking to create. Here's an example. We're back to another robot video. This one's less scary. It's building a brick wall. Again, the idea that you can start to bring some of the manufacturing capability into more traditional construction type sectors. This is, the world of capturing data about the built environment is just rapidly moving. We've gone from drone data capture being an idea probably 2 or 3 years ago to now it's becoming pretty standard. This is a demo from Red Rocks in Colorado, where the drone's capturing high definition video, and that's been turned into a 3-dimensional data set, which you can then put into a 3-dimensional model and then actually start doing design and building around that. This is becoming pretty mainstream already. And as I said, actually virtual reality has become a fairly standard tool now for design reviews and those sorts of things. We were involved in design of a casino in Australia, and it's quite common to get the client to come and look at a 3-dimensional model and observe, and they'd done that and it all looked fine, and then got them to put the headset on and actually have the experience of walking through the lobby and foyer of this new casino, and this CEO basically said, actually that bulkhead's a lot lower than what I thought it would be, and wouldn't have been able to have that experience until actually walking into the thing after several $100 million have been spent building it. And so it was a lot cheaper to address that at that point in time. So you can imagine what that's like in terms of engaging the community and some of the things that we're looking at doing in the environment. We're seeing that happen more and more in terms of public consultation. Here's, I guess, a way of using that information to visualise and communicate with stakeholders and the public what might be happening in a project. This is the Queen's Wharf development in Brisbane. It's about a $3.8 billion mixed-use development involving both public and private assets. Some of the public assets have to be upgraded and then handed back. So you can imagine it's quite a contentious project. There's a lot of politics involved. But as a way of communicating what does this look like and getting people involved, this is actually more of an architectural fly-through tool. what we're seeing, and you'll see there are people moving around on this, I think we're starting to see a convergence of the transport modelling, the energy modelling, all the other things that you will do as part of building this, actually integrated, so it becomes a kind of a gaming environment, if you like, to really help improve the whole human experience. So you can imagine you can take pretty much any stakeholder and look at, okay, well, what's the impact for me? Is it a good thing or negative thing? And what can be done about it? This next one I want to show you is another large project. This is basically a big urban regrowth project in New York. It's the Hudson Yards, and they're effectively building about $3 billion worth of asset over the top of a working rail yard. So there are a few challenges with that. So one aspect is looking at the logistics of how we're actually going to build this thing without disrupting the operation of the city. But they're also running it from a ground up, designing for insight. So the whole thing is basically being designed to have Internet of Things up the wazoo, lots of sensors, building management systems, all of those things tied together, so that once the thing's up and running, there's a great opportunity to look at, okay, well, how do you optimize, whether it's energy or understand what's going on in that whole environment, which is obviously a hugely expensive thing to try and retrofit later on. So that's real footage, and then they're starting to overlay. So this is actually visualizing what the construction sequencing might look like, just to test actually, will it be feasible? Are we going to impact things? So again, as a means of communicating change impact and perhaps addressing resistance and so on around the project, and just understanding. So it's pretty clear from those examples that technology is rapidly moving. Our ability to create new and different assets is really only limited by imagination in that sense. Having this information is allowing us to look at how we operate. And there's a lot of stuff out of smart cities kind of material and so on around what that means in terms of the opportunities to improve the efficiency and operation across all of the different aspects of a city. So the idea that we can measure pretty much everything that's going on, that we have understanding of, are there security events, are there transport problems, what's going on, being able to be more efficient with how we maintain various bits of the infrastructure. And in a number of places, cities are making it easier for citizens to actually identify, well, actually that light there seems to be broken, and getting that information understood. But I think where this is kind of heading, it's back to what I talked about earlier in terms of this embedded intelligence, is this idea of contextual cities where, because the environment knows who you are, what you're trying to do and so on, it's actually making it an elegant and seamless process for you to do what you need to do, rather than you having to take a lot of action and spend a lot of your own time organising those sorts of things. Probably the closest example I found a while ago on this topic was, this is from the Rio Olympics. So there was basically this city command centre established, which was bringing in, with the help of IBM and others, a whole lot of information about everything happening in the city, so that they could marshal resources to best address logistics and run the events, run the games without too many issues, but lots of different agencies represented. So I guess just to round all of that out, the reality of all of this availability of technology is actually, when you think about the challenges that we have in front of us, we've never had as many resources as a human race as we have at our disposal today. Actually, the only thing that's limiting us, really is our imagination. And I hope I've illustrated that we can actually engage people in all aspects of creating the infrastructure, with the beauty and the livability and the vibrancy that actually we want. Our challenge is actually the speed with which we make good decisions. And so I think looking for ways in which we can put decision-making bodies in place, how we can leverage technology and insight to help make quicker and better decisions and make changes faster, I think is the real challenge and opportunity that sits in front of us. So thanks very much for your time. And, I'll get to Rupert.